For today's session, Nick is going to dive into the secrets of Agile and explore 3 ways you can start, maintain, and accelerate a successful transformation to greater agility. And with that, over to you, Nick.
Super. Thanks so much, Olaf. It's lovely to be here. And folks, thanks for joining us. It's great to have the opportunity today to share some of my takeaways that I've put together over a decade of agile transformations at fast growth companies. So let's dive into it. As Olaf mentioned, today we're going to be talking about outcomes, not output. So our teams and our organizations, yours and mine, and many others around the world, in fact, should be striving to get the benefits of agility and not merely perform the rituals of Agile or Scrum or Kanban. The primary measure of an agile organization is whether it's delivering value to its customers on an ongoing, regular basis. And that's the outcome that every agile transformation should be seeking: the ability to respond to the needs, wants, and desires of customers over time. And we know that the pace of change in our environments, our business environments, is accelerating. So having a fair degree of agility in your business is really important. Unfortunately, like sometimes people lose sight of this desired outcome, this greater agility of our organizations and our ability to deliver value to our customers. And some people in the agile community, they get more caught up in promoting a particular brand of agile. And I think we just need to be conscious of that. So I wanted to talk about that at the outset. While there are many tools and practices that your organization can pull on to help you attain greater agility, you need to remember that every team in every organization is on their own journey to greater agility. So every talk you listen to, this one included, you need to treat with a healthy dose of skepticism and see it as someone speaking from their experience and not providing advice. And so I'm not trying to provide advice today because I'm not standing in your shoes, working in your team or your organization. I don't have your customers, your contracts, or your business model, right? You are your own unique snowflake. I just want to provide and share a little bit of perspective based on my own experience. So today, because I'm going to share my experience over the past decade, I hope that what you take from this is 1 or 2 techniques or practices that you can experiment with in your own organizations. So we're going to explore 3 ways that you can start, maintain, and accelerate a successful agile transformation. We're going to dive into the secrets of agile, starting from where you are, improving the effectiveness of the team, and experimentation for continuous learning and improvement within the team and the organization more broadly. So the first bit is starting from where you are. So let's dive in. Now, if you've been keeping an eye on the agile world for a long enough time, you probably have come across or heard of the Salesforce Big Bang transformation. In 2006, Salesforce embarked on a 3-month transformation to move 30 teams from waterfall to agile practices. And at the time, the agile or the change team behind this transformation, they wrote a report basically citing that this was the first Big Bang successful agile transformation on record. And that crew, pioneered by Chris Fry and Steve Green, they were really the pioneers in large-scale agile at the time. And these days, the numbers only get bigger. You know, we're not talking 30 teams moving from waterfall to agile. At Easy Agile, we're meeting with customers that are doing, planning across 50 teams, or they're trying to bring together 500 teams. In my own experience at Twitter, by the time I left Twitter, we had 300 agile teams. So the scale today is altogether different from where it was 10 or 15 years ago. Now, while Salesforce did a Big Bang transformation and changed the roles and responsibilities and the teams within this 3-month period, they faced a ton of challenges and their work was absolutely not done, right? Today, a decade on, they still have an agile transformation team. And so the thing to remember and that we're going to look at is that agile transformations are journeys which continue forever. You know, I'm yet to meet a company that said, look, thanks, Nick, we're agile, all done here, no room for improvement, right? I mean, can you actually imagine that? Can you imagine saying some company saying, no, we're good. We can't get any better than we are, perfection. And so these are transformations that take years and we need to be prepared for that. My role at Twitter was to bring greater agility to the company. And while my title was technical program manager, I was actually directly reporting to those people, Steve Green, and Chris Fry from Salesforce that led the transformation there. I was in great company, right? I was with some of the pioneers of large-scale Agile. However, trying to do a big bang transformation at Twitter was absolutely not on the cards. We weren't transforming a stable, traditional organization from waterfall to Agile. We were transforming a hypergrowth startup from absolute chaos into Agile, right? So we were coming from the other end of the spectrum. To give you a sense of hypergrowth, in my first 12 months at Twitter, we added over 1,000 software engineers to our product and engineering organization. So there was no way that I or even a team of product and engineering leaders with passion and experience with Agile could keep up with the incoming, the new people joining the company. And at the end of the day, the culture at Twitter was such that it wouldn't lend itself to a big bang change. It was just a very different organization to what took place at Salesforce. And so long story short, we had to find a sustainable pace for ourselves and do a transformation that, or embark upon a transformation, I should say, that we later learned would be a multi-year effort. We could only move as fast as the slowest leader in the organization, right? So you've heard the term, the buffalo only move as a pack as fast as the slowest buffalo moves. That was the experience that we had at Twitter. So the slowest leader in the organization to get the Agile practices, that was as fast as we could move. On this journey to greater agility at Twitter, we encountered so many organizational impediments to change, even for a company that was at such a young age. So when I joined the company, it was only 6 or 7 years old. So it's not like we had like a larger enterprise that's been around for 40 or 50 years, but we still had a significant number of impediments. And that was things like employees versus contractors and co-located versus distributed versus remote team members. Generally, what you find in large-scale transformations is that there's a whole host of organizational decisions that have been made over the past 10, 15, 20 years that we need to sometimes unwind or morph into something that will support an agile transformation. In fact, when Yahoo in 2013, they laid off a couple of hundred remote workers, and Marissa Mayer at the time made the decision to bring everyone back into their main Yahoo campuses. And we at the time decided to take a big punt and bring all these people on board. More throughput, we thought, or at least some of our leaders at Twitter thought more throughput. But it was throughput at the expense of collaboration. It was throughput at the expense of effectiveness. And so, what I learned through this experience of hiring all these remote workers was really one that we needed to have a more thoughtful approach to how we built the company and not be so reactionary. And I was sharing my frustration about these impediments with a gentleman by the name of Ray Arel. And Ray Arel worked at Intel, and he was part of the Agile Industry Consortium that I also participated in. And he explained to me, why some of my frustration had come about. And I was trying to change Twitter in 2 or 3 years. Fast pace, hyper growth. Like we can do this. We can do a transformation at scale really quick. We're different. Well, reality was we weren't too different to any other organizations that were trying to do change. Change is hard. And Ray had been leading the Agile transformation at Intel for over 15 years. So he was approaching Agile transformations at Intel by working with engineering managers that were becoming directors. Those people would then become VPs. And so, Ray's kind of approach was, I'm on a 15-year journey with someone to go from an engineer to the CEO of a business unit. And if I can help them understand lean and agile principles as an engineer, and I can grow with them over time, then we'll have some success at Intel. And as people were promoted into positions of greater influence based on their agility in their organizations, it could exert more pressure on the organization as a whole for greater agility. And so to Ray, patience was the key thing for this organizational change. Not to say that this is the right approach for every organization, but it was great perspective for me on my own journey to greater agility at Twitter. And so where I ended up reflecting on my experience at Twitter, looking back on it, was really about the journey. If we return to the Salesforce example that I shared earlier of doing a big bang transformation, a shock change to Scrum over the course of 3 months, what they actually started with was going off the Scrum guidebook. They were very much focused on, let's just replicate what others have told us works at a smaller scale, and let's just scale that up. And then over time, as they, years into this, as they started to be more familiar with it and have more confidence, the team at Salesforce, the Agile transformation team there, they created their own method. It wasn't Scrum, it was the adaptive delivery model. And so having the adaptive delivery model was really important for them because it meant that it had that Salesforce ethos in it. And then over time, they began to introduce aspects of Kanban, and then they finally turned their attention to the lean principles. And so this idea of shuhari, which is used in Japanese martial arts to really talk about the evolution of someone's approach or their journey to self-learning and development over time. And that's what Salesforce saw, and we actually started with something totally different at Twitter. We started with this focus on the lean principles, because when Chris Fry and Steve Green left Salesforce and came to Twitter, their most recent knowledge at Salesforce was around the lean principles. They were a very effective, agile organization at Salesforce, and they just came into Twitter going, well, let's focus on the lean principles. That's where it's at. When really, in reality, we had to go right back to the beginning, and we went back to the beginning and we started at Shu. And we were teaching teams how to go through the motions of Scrum or Kanban, how to configure an Agile board in Jira software. Like seriously, it was basics for some of these teams. But over time, we developed our own method of Agile at Twitter, and it was called Agility. The handle Agility was what we called it. And then, of course, over time, it went on to higher and higher things. And so, today, the Agile transformation team at Salesforce is still on this journey. Today, the Agile transformation team at Twitter is still on the journey, and that journey is always evolving. I think just if I think about one other example from Twitter, it's about the evolution of a single engineering manager in our revenue group and how they thought about improving their group, their team. It started out that they'd asked me to come and facilitate a retrospective. Hey, I've seen other teams talk about retrospectives. I've seen a few of these whiteboards. I want one for my team. And so we got this team started, this engineering manager and their team started with a very formulaic, what went well, what didn't go well, retrospective. And then this engineering manager started to facilitate and run retrospectives for other teams in revenue and in other groups in the company. And over time, that engineering manager developed with their team their own sort of approach to the retrospective. And as she got into the groove, it was a Friday afternoon, coffees at a coffee shop called Marvelous. And it was a sit-down chat, how debrief on the week. How did it go? And I thought that was interesting because for her, the coffee shop was a safe space for people in her team. They weren't in the office, they were out of the office. And it showed to me this evolution of shuhari. How had this engineering manager gone from, tell me what to do, to I'm learning this task and I've got my own things that I want to play with, to I've really got this and I've found something that works super well for my team. So I think the takeaway for me with all of this is it's not about getting to the destination, and it's certainly not about getting there quickly. It just doesn't exist with an agile transformation, as the only thing is continuous improvement. So it's all about the journey, and you need to enjoy the journey. And starting from where you are means that you're finding a path to greater agility and a sustainable pace that works for you and your organization. It makes absolutely no sense if you burn yourself out and you wear yourself out, kind of like what I did in the early days at Twitter, only to find that, hang on, there's still a multi-year effort ahead of us, right? You need to have the perseverance and the the sustainable pace to go on for the long term. So I want to make sure that you understand that. So next we're going to look at improving team effectiveness. Now, at Twitter, the smallest unit that we cared about was a team. When I arrived, people often talked about individual contributors, but we worked over a couple of years to refocus leadership on team being the smallest unit that they should talk about, think about. It was no longer Bob, because Bob or Sally can't get anything done on their own. Even as an engineer at Twitter, you had to get a ship it. You had to get 2 other people from your team or from other teams to actually approve the code review or the pull request, get that code into production, get it out the door. So there was no concept really of an individual. You had to be part of a team to get something done. And it was really interesting because we had engineering managers at Twitter, and one in particular, I remember a young gentleman, and he was explaining to me that his team had so much work in progress because he was optimizing for hands-on keyboards. And it was fascinating because, here he's got all of these individual contributors, and he wants to have, he's got a team of 8 people, but he doesn't see it as a team of 8 people. He sees it as 8 individual streams of work. But of course, he wasn't able to ship anything to production because everything got caught up in code review. And it was a completely ineffective way for the team to actually operate. And either way, they weren't delivering value to the customer. So what we actually helped educate that engineering manager was about, slowing down the rate of work entering the system, entering that team, meant that the team could stay on top of their code reviews, and they could ultimately ship code more frequently with less rework. And that particular team, they took their code review, so their wait time in code review, they took it from 10 days down to 2 days. So that was a significant transformation just by limiting the amount of work that was entering the system. And that was an example for us of team effectiveness over efficiency. It also turned out to be efficiency, but it was team effectiveness as well. So underlying all of this for us at Twitter was the lean principles. I'm sure you understand the story of where the lean principles came from, and I should say that broadly speaking, but we, the West, borrowed heavily and were heavily influenced by the Toyota production system and the approach that Toyota used to manufacture cars. And then obviously Mary and Tom Poppendick, amongst others, have done a lot of work in educating, not just from a manufacturing perspective, but from a software engineering perspective. How do we apply lean principles to software development? And so we would talk at length at Twitter about eliminating waste. And so that example of code reviews earlier was an example of waste. Amplifying learning, deciding as late as possible, delivering as fast as possible. Again, like minimize wait time in code review, minimize any wait time in the value stream that we can. Empowering the team is a big one. You obviously, you may not know this, but there's a movement today that's kind of like the opposite perhaps to some of the scaling agile frameworks, and it's the modern agile frameworks, and it's really about safety and empowering the team and providing a safe space for the team to work. Building integrity in, obviously, quality from the get-go. Don't get it out the door only to have to go and do a whole lot of rework. But the thing that really stuck with us at Twitter was optimizing the whole, and this was the one that we worked tirelessly at Twitter to try and get engineering leaders, and these were seasoned directors and in some cases VPs that had come from waterfall organizations, and we were trying to get them to understand that what they were doing in their group to make their group more effective, more efficient. Let me repeat that. We had to educate VPs that what they were doing to make their group more efficient actually made the whole company less efficient and less effective. And what was great for one team was terrible for the whole organization. So, a very simple example of this, and perhaps one that people here can relate to, was that we had one team that chose a different JavaScript testing framework to what was in use amongst 80 other teams. And no other team had experience with this particular framework except this one team. And, you know, you could say immediately it's a better framework and it allows us to move faster and write better tests and all this sort of stuff. But the downside of that is, while it's better for that one team, at scale, it meant that people from other teams couldn't contribute to that team's code base easily. They needed other tooling. They needed to download other dependencies on their development environment, you know, other deploy tools and all that sort of stuff. So what it did is it built a silo within the group that ultimately slowed down the company. And you know, it was something that was intended to speed up this particular team, but it slowed down product and engineering as a whole. And you know, in that scenario, if the team had felt so strongly about that particular framework, what we actually introduced was the Twitter architecture group. And the Twitter architecture group was a group that they were senior and staff software engineers from across all parts of product and engineering, and they would meet on a quarterly basis. And on a 6-monthly basis, they would publish a technology radar. And so the technology radar is something that we just borrowed straight off ThoughtWorks. ThoughtWorks has been doing a technology radar for many years, but we had an internal version of it at Twitter. And so we, in this case of the JavaScript testing framework, it was like, we are sunsetting support for this framework. We are encouraging adoption of this framework. And that was the way that we ultimately found by late 2014, early 2015, we could move changes across 300 agile teams in terms of some of these architectural decisions, move them in a positive direction that didn't impact the effectiveness of the whole product and engineering organization. So I thought that was really important and something that was certainly valuable for us. One of the other pieces that I suppose wasn't immediately apparent to me, but became apparent due to a gentleman by the name of Peter Siebel. We had a group at Twitter that was originally called Developer Productivity, or DevProd. And this was the first team that I worked on, and there were 7 people. And so 7 people were tasked with keeping up all the build, deploy, test infrastructure for, you know, what became 2,000 engineers. And this group morphed into the engineering effectiveness, this team, DevProd, of 7 people, morphed into the engineering effectiveness group, which became 70 engineers at its peak. And Peter Siebel, who I mentioned, he was really instrumental in helping me change my understanding of this. And he talked about impact. And if you could save an engineer 5 minutes a day on their deployment cycle to a staging server, if that's indeed what it took, and you've got 1,500 engineers, you're saving a tremendous amount of time over the entire organization over the course of a year, right? Like it absolutely pays for itself. And so this is how we looked at it. And the way that Peter and his team ultimately started to prioritize their backlog was based upon, you know, how much time can we cut? Like, how much waste can we eliminate? What's the biggest bang for our buck? And they went and chased down things like internal API documentation, obviously deploy tooling, test tooling, things like that. But it was a small investment that paid off many times over. So it was a multiplier. And that's the way that we ended up looking at engineering effectiveness, as being a multiplier for the entire engineering organization. You know, I think in my own experience at Atlassian, you know, I thought we were doing tremendously well when we were deploying Greenhopper to our cloud customers once a week on a Sunday. And today at Easy Agile, we can deploy something for one of our products and it can go from a code review into production in 1 minute. And we can do that whenever we want during the day. So, you know, how can we leverage these engineering effectiveness, these developer productivity approaches to actually improve the feedback loop and speed the feedback loop with our customers to make sure that we are delivering value? The final aspect that I wanted to touch on for improving team effectiveness was actually around stability. And this was probably one of the most important, actually, things that we found through research at Twitter. So in my role, I worked with our human resources, our HR BPs, and our human resources analytics team to figure out the change in people. So people's moving from one team to another. And what we actually found, there was a very strong correlation. I won't say causation, but there was a very strong correlation between team stability and achieving their outcomes. So we used a technique at Twitter called OKRs, Objectives Key Results. It's popularized by Andy Grove from Intel, and there's a host of other companies that have adopted it. And it was the framework that we chose for our Objectives Key Results at Twitter. And the teams that were stable over the course of 3, 6, 12, 18 months, they were much more likely to achieve their outcomes and have high customer satisfaction, whether those customers were internal or external. And you know, we had a new VP of engineering. They weren't new to the company, but they were new to the role. And as soon as they stepped into this role, within a few months, they called a code red. And a code red was, shit, we have a really big problem. Let's pull the best and brightest from all of our teams and let's go solve this problem. But you can imagine, of course, what happens when you pull the best and brightest from 30 or 40 teams and you pull them together onto one team that's going to solve some really important problem. Those 30 or 40 other teams absolutely crater. They don't get any of their quarterly goals done. The most senior person on the team that does code review is suddenly not there. So all of the junior developers are kind of at a loss, like, what am I supposed to be doing? How do I get better? And ultimately, all of these other teams miss their deliverables. And so we had the data, thankfully, from our work with the HR analytics crew to actually show that stability was important, and it stopped the practice of the leadership, the VPs, calling a code red. So having that data for us was really important in that respect. So improving team effectiveness, super important. I can't overstate like how important this is to get this right, have the stability in your teams, and make sure that they're able to do their jobs effectively. So the next piece that we're going to turn to is the final section that I wanted to really focus on, which was experiment to improve. And continuous learning is you know, we're trying to continuously improve ourselves, our team, the company. And one of the things that we found so valuable and that we'll dive into was you know, sharing tacit knowledge. Certainly at scale, one of the things that became apparent for us at Twitter was that you know, I talked earlier about unique snowflakes, and you're on this, you know, your team and your organization is a unique snowflake. But what we found at Twitter was that there are teams that have experimented with this before. So how can we make sure that we're providing an environment where we can learn as quickly as possible about different techniques and practices that are going on within the organization? And you know, we really wanted to have a learning organization at Twitter, and huge credit to Chris Fry, who was the VP of engineering. He thought so highly of continuous improvement that he actually bought and integrated into Twitter Maracana, which was a consulting organization that did training. So this was a company, I should say, that did full-time training around the world for engineers in different, you know, languages, practices, techniques, and so on and so forth. Twitter bought that company and turned them into the Twitter University, which was a really you know, selfish thing to do, but it just went to demonstrate for me at least how much value our early leadership placed on having this capability to learn and adapt over time. And so it ended up being, Twitter University ended up being 16 people focused full-time on multiplying the rest of the organization. Kind of like that engineering effectiveness, only they weren't focused on the tooling so much. They were focused on the tacit knowledge in people's heads and making sure that they were sharing that. So, you know, one of the things that I touched on earlier was the retrospectives. And I got into the habit at Twitter. I mean, I was running retrospectives, obviously, at Atlassian, but generally at Atlassian, I was running retrospectives for my team. And if I think back on it now, I don't actually recall running retrospectives for other teams, or indeed having someone else run a retrospective for my team, for the Jira Agile team at Atlassian. Whereas at Twitter, I took a totally different approach. I was never running a retrospective for my team. I was running retrospectives and facilitating them for other people's teams. And that meant that the product manager, the engineering manager, it meant that everyone in that other team could be fully present and invested in the conversation that was taking place. You know, if you're the product manager and you're trying to run the retrospective, you can't really contribute, right? You're just trying to play catch up to what's actually going on in the room. So having an external facilitator come in was really valuable. And this actually started out, I ran a large scale retrospective for our engineering leadership for 150 engineering managers. And it was really interesting that for many of them, it was the first time that they'd ever run a retrospective. And the 150 engineering managers from across the company were looking at, they were each tasked with facilitating it for their table. This was at an offsite event. But they were each tasked with looking at how the actual product and engineering organization was going. And so, you know, thinking about the experience there, it really introduced these engineering managers to the concept of retrospectives, but we had so much more work to do because they didn't feel comfortable running it for their teams. And they didn't, in a lot of instances, want to look vulnerable in front of their teams, not knowing how to do something. And so that was something that we had to overcome. And so the way that we basically frame this is that we would say, okay, like, you know, you want to do a retrospective, but you don't want to run the retrospective. So we've got to train the facilitators. And so we went out and worked with, and I would run, for instance, I would run 1 or 2 retrospectives for a particular engineering manager. And then that engineering manager would have to go and run a retrospective that I would observe. They would run a retrospective for another team. And they do that a couple of times, and we got them into this loop, and then they were on their own. And so we built this crew that could actually go out and run retrospectives across the organization. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, adapt the style to suit your team. If you want to go out and have a coffee at a coffee shop or something like that, you know, please do that. Like the network engineering team, they would go to the pub across the road. And the network engineering team, for their retrospectives, I think it was more of like a cry on my shoulder kind of thing. Like they were always under the pump. But that's how they, you know, they released their frustration and came up with ideas to improve how their team was operating. I touched on Twitter University and back to school. And one of the things that we did as part of Twitter University that didn't come to us immediately was really rolling our efforts around conferences and book clubs into Twitter University. So historically, you know, like people took a JavaScript book club and they'd read JavaScript language guides and and they'd come together, and it was a very informal thing. And we had people going off to conferences, but it was onesie twosies, and there was no real holistic sort of plan around it. And so coming back to optimizing the whole, we brought this into Twitter University. And so on our Twitter University events page, not only would you see the introduction to Scala, the introduction to iOS development, you know, managing a backlog for product owners 101, you'd also see, you know, JavaScript book club or software like Sri, you know, site reliability engineer, you know, book club, things like that. And I think bringing these to raising the visibility of these was really important from the point of view that what once might have been very, you know, how does someone that's new to the company, if you just think back to, like, we had 1,000 new engineers join us in 2013. Like, how do I introduce 1,000 people to all of the bits and pieces that are going on in the Twitter internal community? And so bringing it all together was really important. And sending people to conferences, it wasn't sending, you know, 2 or 3 people to the Grace Hopper conference. It was, okay, how can we do this properly? How can we get 50 or 60 people to go to the Grace Hopper conference? And how can we get 5 of them to have a talk and 3 of them to be on a panel? And what does it take to actually have a meaningful impact and disseminate this information across the organization when they come back from the conference? And that's where the flocks really came in. So if you think about flocks, like flocks is kind of like the equivalent of that adaptive delivery model at Salesforce. It's taking something that's really common, but it's branding it your own way. it was amazing for us, like having these flocks. You'd come back from a conference and let's do a debrief on this conference. And so again, this is on Twitter University, but it's kind of like a lunch and learn. What are the 5 key things that I learned from this conference? And we obviously, like at Easy Agile today, we still do this. One of our team members, Jared, went down to a conference, the JavaScript conference, the week before last, and he came back and he'd written up all of his notes, and he came back and he gave us a debrief on a Monday about all of the things that he'd learned, the people he'd met, the funny conversations he's had. And so we are getting so much value out of it, and we've only just sent him, right? It's not always possible to send 50 or 100 people to a conference. We sent one person, but we still got, I'd probably say 50, 60, 70% of the value out of it, just from listening to his retelling of the important points from that conference. Of course, in the case of Twitter, like these flocks, while they appeared on the Twitter University events page, they were very much community led. So there was a community owner that was passionate about something, and we just wanted to support them. And some of the ways that we went to supporting them was we got into the habit that we would not book meetings over lunch. So previously, like someone would go, oh, Nick's got an hour in his calendar at 12 o'clock. I'm just going to book some time so I can catch up with him, and I'll do a lunch with him. Well, we got out, like, let's get out of that habit. Let's leave time and do, 1 to many sessions over lunch times for many different topics. We also did Net Promoter Score. So at the end of every Twitter University, at the end of every flock, at the end of every book club, every one of the participants that checked in at that event would get a Net Promoter Score. And this was a way for the person that was leading that session to know how were they doing, where could they improve. And the Twitter University team would give out awards for like most improved presenter. I mean, how cool is that, right? Like I'm going above and beyond. This is not part of my day job, but I'm trying to learn, and I'm trying to share something I'm passionate about. And I get a little, I get some movie tickets or something like that because I've most improved in my NPS over the course of a quarter. So what we really did is we elevated these subject matter experts across Twitter, and we made them the domain experts that many people across the company would turn to, regardless of their geographic location. It was all about getting the tacit knowledge out of these people's heads. There was a gentleman, Chris Anichek, who was very big in the open source community and worked at Twitter, and he was based in Austin, but he would be flying constantly around the world, visiting all of our offices to share the latest and greatest from the open source world. So, these are the things that we've touched on today. We've gone from start from where you are, so starting an agile transformation from where the organization is today, improving team effectiveness over time, super important, and experimentation for continuous learning and improvement. So we want to start, maintain, and accelerate these transformations to greater agility in our organizations. And sometimes we get too caught up in that, is this the right way to do agile? And of course that can't be further from the truth. So my experience has taught me that there's no silver bullet, there's no one method, there's no right way to be agile. There are a ton of agile anti-patterns to be aware of and ideally to avoid. Experimenting with various practices presents an opportunity to learn, and you shouldn't be afraid of experimentation and failure around those experiments. And obviously being prepared for the environment you operate in to shift over time is healthy, because being prepared for that forces you to have that capability to adapt. So the things that I wanted to leave you with was enjoy your journey to greater agility. The journey there is as much fun as I mean, there is no destination. It's a continuous, right? But it can be a really fun and rewarding journey for you personally and for the organization. So enjoy it. Focusing on effectiveness at the team and at the organizational level is absolutely imperative. This is where you're going to see the benefits of agility manifest on a day-to-day basis. And it's like compound interest. It's just going to build up over time. And finally, experiment to improve, right? Frame the changes in your organization, frame the changes to processes and practices and roles, frame them as experiments, right? We're going to see if this makes us more effective. We're going to experiment with this. And if it does improve things, that's great. If it doesn't improve things, drop it. But when you frame it as an experiment, there's very little downside right, to failing. Whereas if this is the thing we're doing and it fails, it kind of feels really bad on the culture. And so with that, I'd like to say good luck, and we'll turn it over to questions. Obviously as well, thank you so much for Olaf and to Tempo for hosting. We've got about 15 minutes on the clock for any Q&A, and you can always reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, email, so on and so forth. Incidentally, if you're interested in any of the Easy Agile apps for Jira, we have a user story mapping add-on for Jira Software, and we have a road mapping add-on for Jira Software. We've got a little over 1,200 customers around the world today, mainly in Western Europe and North America. And we've actually seen quite a lot of uptake in the story mapping practice more recently, but obviously road mapping is something that's been around for a long, long time. So happy to talk to any of those practices as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nick. It was some great insights you had there. Some really interesting real world stories that you could share. And I would like to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a recording after the webinar as well as the slides. For questions, if you have any questions, please add them to the question pane. First up, maybe if you can tell us a little bit about, Nick, so how can you get leaders on board with Agile transformation? What if they're like hesitant to join in? What can you do?
Oh yeah, that's great, Olaf. So it's one of the things that I touched on earlier, like the vulnerability. Sometimes what I found was some of the leaders that weren't familiar with these techniques or practices, they didn't want to be seen as not knowing anything in front of their team, and so there'd be a lot of bluster, like there'd be a lot of hot air. And what we would do is we would reach out to them very delicately, or sometimes they would reach out to me, to be fair, but we would reach out very delicately and we would ask, you know, would they like to be put in touch with someone at another company that has gone through, that's in a similar position, so that maybe a VP at another company or a director at another company, and a company that's already on that journey, that agile transformation journey. And that turned out to be quite a good technique. It obviously does require you to have and leverage a network. But what I found was, even if it was, you know, I think of one example where I was trying to find someone that had deep experience in search and relevance, and just reaching out to a random person that was in that role at a company that I'd heard was doing good things in the agile space, and asking a director there with that title. And they were more than happy to sit down with our director and spend some time and have a coffee and share some perspective, their perspective from a similar transformation.
All right, good. Here's a bit of a technical question. How can you incorporate automation into the reduction of waste, such as auto-generating timesheets and the closing of tasks in Jira? Do you have any recommendations in that field?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think, you know, there's so much that you can do with APIs, the programming interfaces for products these days. And you know, the Easy Agile apps, the Tempo apps, Jira, they're no different. We know of customers, we know of Easy Agile customers that have integrated directly with the APIs that we use. And they've done that to integrate their existing tools with our products. At Twitter, we use this extensively. I mean, our whole deployment cycle, if you're not aware, like Twitter was actually a regulated company from a user privacy perspective. And so we had to do regular audits from the Federal Communications Commission in the US. And all of our deployments had to go through 2 shippers. That is, 2 people had to do a ship it, and every deployment to any production service had to be logged in a Jira ticket. And that was part of the way that we actually, you know, part of the automation that we provided, so that it was really easy and quick for us to complete an audit, right? I mean, all of the data's there. Technically, you cannot get anything into production unless it's gone through 2 shippers and it's been logged in Jira. Super simple. And all of that was automated and tied in. We had a product called Falcon that then got renamed to Millennium Falcon, that actually orchestrated all that. And that was the developer productivity group was responsible for that. Today here at Easy Agile, one of the things that we do as part of our Bitbucket pipeline is we do a license check. You know, as a provider of software, we want to make sure that that we don't include GPL software or GPL libraries, I should say, in our software, because that could put us and potentially our customers in a grey legal area. It's not worth the risk. So if one of these licenses, if we happen to pick up a library through some transitive dependency, let's stop that from being committed to master. Like, let's just deal with that now. Let's not deal with the ramifications of it, which will be a lot more expensive in 3, 6, 12 months time.
Yep, sounds like you can definitely find some tools to help you automate stuff. There's another question. If I'm a small business, what should I start doing today on my Agile journey? Like, what's the first thing you would recommend to do?
Oh, I love it. I mean, you know, not having a lot more context to go on, I'd hate to say something flippant, but really, I think you can do yourself a world of good by learning from a lot of other people's experience. And so, read widely. Ideally, try and get in contact with people that that are on a similar journey or have been on a similar journey before. You know, you could go to a local meetup, an Agile meetup, for instance, or a lean coffee. I think that's really valuable. What I found as I stepped into this role at Twitter. Twitter was, when I joined, a much larger company than Atlassian. And so I was on the back foot immediately. Not a small company, yes, but I needed to learn. And so that's why I found the Agile Industry Consortium, which was for other enterprises doing Agile. And we met on a quarterly basis with people from across North America that were doing Agile transformations at scale. And sometimes it was a shoulder to cry on. You know, like, this is so damn hard. But at the same time, they would also give you encouragement and motivation to keep going. For myself, as the owner of a small business, I actually participate in forums. I have a forum called the Kaizen Forum, and it's a bunch of business owners that are in tech and other industries, and we get together to talk about various challenges that our businesses face. And again, like the thrust of this talk, this is my experience. So you don't ask these other people for advice, you ask them for experience. And if they haven't experienced that, then, you know, just pass. They're just brainstorming ideas, and that's not really what you're looking for.
Cool. Maybe there's a question about SAFe. So what is your position on SAFe, like Scaled Agile Framework? Yeah,
so the Scaled Agile Framework has been getting a lot of airtime over the past couple of years. It seems to be, based on the conversations that we've had with customers, it seems to be the preferred approach to, or the preferred framework for scaling Agile within an organization, a larger organization. I think, you know, the latest version of SAFe, it has kind of 4 different levels of complexity, and they're responding to the organizations that they're meeting. So it's interesting to see that they are adapting over time. And I think that's really healthy, because back in the day, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, when SAFe was rolling out, it seemed like it was a big bang, you know, implement SAFe. It was like the old school Agile transformations. You do Scrum, you do it by the guidebook, like, just do what we say and you'll get it done, you know. Whereas, you know, for SAFe in a large organization, I think having a little bit more awareness of the environment in which you find yourself is probably really valuable. And there are some things that you just can't change overnight. But there's an ideal there. So I think it's probably really healthy to have that out there as a framework for people to rally around.
Right, excellent. To the audience, if you have questions, we still have time for a few more questions. Please add them in the question pane. But in the meantime, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the practices that you employ at Easy Agile. So talk about your experience now and how, yeah, something that we can learn from that.
Yeah, so we take a fairly, like I would call it an agile light approach. In Jira software, we use sprints, but we don't do Scrum. We use sprints basically as a way to collect and bucket up our work so that I can refer back to it in the future, and just see what we did on a week-to-week basis so that the team's output. But interestingly enough, like we name our sprints after women that are our customers or women that are in the media, and we've been doing that for a little over 12 months now. And we use the sprint description field. So for instance, there's a project manager at a bank in Europe, and they're a very large bank, and she is a project manager there that's been doing training for story mapping across the bank. And so we named our sprint after her, and we just put that information, like, you know, she's doing an agile transformation, 300 team, da 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 da. And it's just a great way to connect our team at Easy Agile with our customers. We do a planning session on a Monday morning. It generally runs for about 90 minutes. So we'll typically do 30 to 45 minutes demo up front. And then we do 45 minutes, 30, 45 minutes planning on the tail end, what we're trying to achieve this week and what we'd hope to launch this week. Or, you know, in the case of Tegan and I, like, you know, what emails or conversations we might like to have, events we want to prepare. I suppose we're a little bit different insofar as we've got a lot of families here. Like half the team have young families, and so we kind of leave the office by 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And sometimes some of us will tune in later in the day. So we're not doing a demo on a Friday afternoon and having beers typically. So it's a much more fluid sort of approach that we have that fits in with family life. And I suppose we're able to do that just due to the sheer scale of the business. It's not you know, hundreds of people.
All right, cool. I think this will be our last question. This is about onboarding. So our IT is leading the agile journey, but business is waiting to see if it works. How do we get them on board? These functions include BAs as proxy to PO and keeping the business knowledge instead of disseminating to the team.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. It sounds like a wonderful challenge, right? Like I immediately think, you know, whether it's possible or not, but I immediately think of things like how can we locate these people together? Are they sitting next to one another today? You know, if they're not, what can we do to bring them closer together? You know, we've actually been having a lot of conversations recently with people that are larger organizations, and they're picking up some of these safe practices like the PI planning, the quarterly planning. And they just love it from the point of view that they actually get to meet some of the people that they work with on a day-to-day basis, face to face. And it's interesting to me that, you know, Agile would encourage you to have co-located teams because it's more effective and there's higher bandwidth and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is that these teams are often disjointed. Now, in the case of like the engineering versus the business organization, you know, so IT is leading the Agile journey, but Biz is waiting to see if it works. It's funny. Like, I wonder why, you know, they're waiting to see if it works. It's almost a matter of, is it possible to put some of the leaders from the business group in touch with business leaders at other organizations, just so that they can, like, how do we get them excited that this is going to be great for them? Right? Like, don't lean back, like lean in, get involved. You know, the more energy and emphasis you bring to this Agile transformation with the IT crew, the sooner you're going to start to realize the benefits as the business group. You know, and obviously, you know, from an Agile perspective, like, we want to have visibility. We want to transfer the knowledge as widely as possible. We want to build cross-functional teams of T-shaped people. Like, you know, like, why do we, like Jared, I was just thinking, I mentioned Jared before. He was the gentleman from our team that went to the conference. You know, he's been spending time with Tegan. Even today, Jared was in machine code for an old arcade machine that he's got. Right, it's one of those old, you know, one of those old Pac-Man arcade machines, and he's in the machine code so that he can read the high scores out and send it through to Slack, right? And Tegan's sitting there next to him, learning about all this machine code and byte language. I'm like, I don't understand any of this stuff, but I love the fact that they're sharing this stuff together and learning together. So how do you foster those sorts of opportunities? I think one of the things, sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here because this is kind of exciting, but one of the things that we found really valuable in about 2010, 2011 at Atlassian, we tried an experiment with our Ship It days, which was previously called FedEx days. We tried an experiment where you had to pair up with someone that was outside of product and engineering. So like go and find someone in marketing or someone in legal or someone in HR that's got a problem with some of their tools or their process or what they're doing, and go and solve that problem. Again, coming back to optimize the whole, it was like you have 24 hours to hack it and go and do whatever you want to do, but it can't be like you can't, this time you can't scratch your own itch. You've got to scratch one of your coworkers' itches, right? Someone that can't go and write this code themselves. And that was tremendously effective at alleviating some of the pain across the broader organization. You know, is there some opportunity to run something like a Ship It Day to bring the biz and the IT crew closer together?
Yeah, I love that idea. I'm in marketing, and I would love for a programmer to approach me and ask me, "What's your problem? Can I solve it for you?" I would definitely say yes.
Yeah,
But
exactly right.
Yeah, I would be thrilled. But that's all the time that we have today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Nick, for presenting, and Tegan for organizing with us.